On June 26, 1944, at Hollandia Air Base in Dutch New Guinea, Lieutenant Colonel Charles Lindbergh was focused on a game of checkers with fellow officer Merrill Smith, who handled operations for a unit called Satan's Angels. Their match was suddenly interrupted when a man appeared at the screen door. McDonald didn't catch the name at first, still thinking about his next move in the game, but the visitor calmly repeated it. Charles Lindbergh. Yes, that Charles Lindbergh, the most well-known pilot in America, was now standing in a makeshift rec room, far from home, asking if he could talk about P-38 combat tactics. What no one realized at that moment was that this meeting would change long-range fighter missions in the Pacific. Over the next 6 weeks, Lindbergh would teach flight techniques that increased the P-38 Lightning's range by nearly 400 miles. What seemed impossible would soon become standard practice. But this isn't just a story about better fuel efficiency. It's about overcoming doubt, proving new ideas through results, and pilots learning to trust numbers instead of gut instinct. It's about how one man's deep understanding of how engines use fuel ended up reshaping air combat in the Pacific. These lessons weren't found in technical manuals. They were learned in the air by pilots who began to realize their earlier training had missed something important. The idea that such a dramatic change had come from a civilian who had only just flown a P-38 for the first time 3 days earlier was hard to believe. But that's exactly what happened. The story really started 17 years earlier, over the Atlantic. On May 20th to 21st, 1927, Charles Lindbergh made history by flying solo from New York to Paris, a 3,600-mile journey that took 33 and a half hours. His plane, the Spirit of St. Louis, was packed with 450 gallons of fuel, so much that it blocked his forward view. He relied on a periscope and old-school navigation to get across, carefully managing every bit of fuel. When he landed, he still had 85 gallons left, proof that he had achieved fuel efficiency many thought impossible with the engine he was using. That attention to detail became his trademark. In the 1930s, Lindbergh flew survey routes for Pan American Airways across vast stretches of ocean. During those missions, he refined methods that let planes fly much farther than the listed range. He knew manufacturers only gave rough estimates, not the true limits. He learned how to balance power, fuel use, and engine strain by adjusting throttle settings, propeller speed, fuel mix, and airspeed, a level of understanding most pilots didn't get in standard training. By 1944, Lindbergh was one of the top experts in long-distance flying. But his relationship with the U.S. military was rocky. Before the war, he strongly opposed U.S. involvement in Europe and led the America First Committee. That stance, and especially his public speeches, made him unpopular with President Franklin Roosevelt. In April 1941, after Roosevelt publicly compared him to a controversial Civil War figure, Lindbergh gave up his commission in the Army Air Corps Reserve. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, he tried to rejoin the military. Roosevelt made sure that didn't happen. Lindbergh wasn't allowed to serve in uniform again during the war. Still, his expertise was too valuable to ignore. Since he couldn't serve as an officer, Lindbergh worked as a civilian consultant. In 1943, he joined United Aircraft Corporation, especially their Chance Vought division, which built the F-4U Corsair fighter. He also helped forward fixed production issues with B-24 bombers and tested high-altitude performance in P-47 Thunderbolts. He even helped develop better dive bombing tactics. His technical work was impressive, but Lindbergh wanted more. By early 1944, he found his chance. United Aircraft was interested in exploring potential of a new twin-engine fighter. At the time, the only American model in that category was the Lockheed P-38 Lightning. Charles Lindbergh convinced United Aircraft to send him to the Pacific as a technical representative to observe the P-38 in actual combat. On April 3, 1944, Lindbergh began preparing for his trip to the South Pacific. He stopped by Brooks Brothers in New York to buy a naval officer's uniform without any rank or insignia. He also picked up a small New Testament from Brentano's bookstore. In his journal that day, he noted that if he could only bring one book, that would be it. Something he might not have chosen 10 years earlier, but now found unmatched. He left San Diego on April 24th, officially headed to Marine aviation bases around Guadalcanal. While the Navy approved the trip, it was kept quiet. Even President Roosevelt and Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox weren't told Lindbergh was heading into a war zone. What started as a simple observation, quickly turned into something more. Marine aviation officers invited Lindbergh to join them on real combat flights. On May 21, 1944, he flew his first mission, a low-level attack near the Japanese-held area of Rabaul with Marine Fighting Squadron 222. Though officially listed as an observer, Lindbergh flew fully armed and engaged enemy targets when he had the chance. He proved he wasn't just a theorist. Working closely with F-4U Corsair pilots, Lindbergh helped them safely take off with bomb loads that were double the aircraft's listed capacity. Until then, the Marines had been losing planes due to takeoff accidents from being too heavy. Lindbergh analyzed everything, power settings, takeoff speed, weight distribution, and helped improve safety while also increasing how much firepower they could carry. News of Lindbergh's efforts spread fast. Here was America's most famous aviator flying combat missions as a civilian and solving problems that had frustrated military pilots for months. By mid-June 1944, Lindbergh had his eye on the P-38 Lightning. United Aircraft was seriously looking into twin-engine fighters, and Lindbergh had heard that the 475th Fighter Group, known as Satan's Angels, was one of the top-performing P-38 units in the Pacific. If he wanted to really learn about the Lightning, that was the place to be. On June 15, 1944, he caught a ride to Finschhafen, New Guinea. He checked in with 5th Air Force Headquarters at Nadzab and had lunch with Colonel Marion Cooper. A few days later, on June 18th, he had dinner with General Ennis Whitehead to discuss what was happening in New Guinea and his plans to observe P-38 operations. While Lindbergh didn't have formal orders, that kind of informal approval often carried weight in the Pacific. The command structure there was flexible, and people tended to value results and reputation more than paperwork. On June 20th, Lindbergh spent about 80 minutes getting familiar with the P-38 in a session with the 35th Squadron of the 8th Fighter Group. It was his first flight in the unique twin-boom aircraft. Then, on June 26, he arrived at Hollandia, walking in on Lieutenant Colonel Charles McDonald in the middle of the checkers game. McDonald, at 29 years old, was already an ace with 10 victories and in command of the 475th Fighter Group. The group had been formed in Australia in May 1943 and had become one of the top-scoring P-38 units in the Pacific. Its 3 squadrons, the 431st, 432nd, and 433rd, flew the latest P-38J models, which came with better intercoolers and extra fuel capacity. These updated Lightnings were the longest-range fighters in the region, able to reach targets other aircraft couldn't. Still, even with added fuel tanks, the P-38's range had limits. Flying to far-off targets often meant there wasn't enough fuel left for a full dogfight, and pilots would sometimes land with barely enough gas left. A few planes had been lost after getting diverted by bad weather, stretching fuel past the breaking point. At first, McDonald didn't think much of Lindbergh and went back to his game. But when Lindbergh explained that General Hutchinson, commander of the 3rd Air Task Force, had sent him to talk about P-38 missions, McDonald decided to hear him out. After a short conversation, McDonald asked Lindbergh if he'd like to join a mission the next day. Lindbergh agreed without hesitation. Since the mission would head out at dawn, McDonald suggested he stay the night at the 475th's camp to avoid any transportation issues. As Lindbergh settled onto a spare cot, word spread quickly. The famous pilot was going to fly with Satan's Angels. Reactions were mixed. Some, like Lieutenant John Pererti of the 433rd Squadron, were excited to meet him. Others weren't so sure. They wondered if a 42-year-old civilian, even one as well known as Lindbergh, could handle the fast-paced demands of modern air combat. Major Thomas McGuire, already an ace with 15 victories and on his way becoming the second highest-scoring American fighter pilot of the war, was curious to see how this old guy would do. On the morning of June 27, 1944, Lindbergh got ready for his first combat flight, an AP-38. It was raining steadily at 5:30 a.m., but the weather cleared up by mid-morning, and the mission was able to launch around 10:30. McDonald led a 4-plane flight toward Jeffman Island and Smart Airfield, regular targets for the 475th. Lindbergh flew in the number 3 spot on McGuire's wing. The 4th pilot was Merrill Smith, already credited with 8 victories. As they got airborne, McDonald watched Lindbergh lock into perfect formation beside McGuire. For someone who had just started flying the P-38 days earlier, his precision was impressive. Their mission was to strafe an enemy barge in Kaibobo Bay. Lindbergh flew through anti-aircraft fire, opening up with both cannon and machine guns as he swept the target. All 4 aircraft completed the mission and returned safely. But what happened after they landed would turn out to be more important than the mission itself. When the maintenance crews checked the planes, they noticed something strange. Lindbergh's aircraft consistently came back with much more fuel than the others, even though they had all flown the same missions. On July 1st, during a 6.5-hour recon flight along the western shore of Gilving Bay, Lindbergh landed with 210 gallons of fuel still in his tanks. Other pilots on the same flight were nearly out of gas. Then on July 3rd, the group escorted 16 B-25 bombers on a strike against Jeffman Island. Afterward, the P-38 stayed in the area to hunt enemy barges. About an hour in, 2 pilots had to break off due to low fuel. But Lindbergh kept flying. His gauges still showed solid reserves. That got McDonald's attention. He called a meeting. Just 2 days after Lindbergh's arrival, the colonel gathered the 475th's pilots in their recreation hall, a rough, bare-bones building with dirt floors, a thatched roof, a single ping-pong table, and a few decks of cards. Under bright, bare light bulbs, McDonald introduced Lindbergh and asked him to explain how he was returning with so much more fuel than everyone else. What happened next would change how P-38 missions were flown across the Pacific. Lindbergh stood in front of the group and began explaining the cruise settings he had figured out for the Lightning. At the time, pilots were taught to cruise at 2,200 to 2,400 revolutions per minute with a fuel mixture set to auto-rich. That setup provided steady power and was considered safe for the engines, but also burned fuel quickly. Lindbergh suggested a different approach. He explained that dropping engine speed to 1,600 revolutions per minute, switching the fuel mixture to auto-lean, and increasing manifold pressure slightly to about 30 inches of mercury could maintain cruising speed while using far less fuel. The key numbers he gave were 1,600 revolutions per minute, 30 inches manifold pressure, mixture set to auto-lean, indicated airspeed of 185 miles per hour. With these settings, fuel use dropped to around 70 gallons per hour, giving about 2.6 miles per gallon, compared to the usual setup. This was a huge improvement. Lindbergh estimated that using these techniques could stretch the Lightning's range by up to 400 miles, making 9-hour missions possible. When he finished speaking about 30 minutes later, the room was completely silent. The pilots had a lot to think about after the meeting. One of the first concerns was the idea of a 9-hour flight. Even 7-hour missions were already exhausting. The P-38 cockpit was tight and uncomfortable. Pilots sat on their parachutes, with an emergency raft or pack beneath them. Their survival gear added even more discomfort. Spending 7 hours in that setup pushed human limits. The thought of stretching that to 9 hours felt nearly impossible. Even more unsettling was Lindbergh's advice on engine settings. He was recommending something they had always been told to avoid: using low RPM and high manifold pressure at the same time, a method known as oversquare operation. Military training warned against this combo. Instructors had drilled it in. If the manifold pressure got too far ahead of RPM, engine damage could follow. The fear was detonation, an uncontrolled explosion in the engine cylinders, which could cause overheating and lead to serious failures. Now here was a civilian telling them to do exactly that, on purpose, as standard practice. The room was full of doubt. Some pilots exchanged uncertain looks. A few shook their heads. One spoke up, calling Lindbergh's method dangerous. But Colonel McDonald saw the bigger picture. Lindbergh wasn't just talking theory. He had already flown multiple combat missions using those settings. His engines hadn't failed, and he consistently returned with more fuel than anyone else. That gave him a kind of freedom in the air that other pilots didn't have. McDonnell decided it was worth testing. If Lindbergh's method worked, the 475th would gain a major edge. If not, they'd find out fast. Over the next week, pilots started trying the new cruise settings, carefully and on short flights. That way, they could turn back quickly if anything went wrong. At first, they were uneasy. The engines didn't sound the same. The usual high-revving roar dropped to a deeper tone at the lower RPM. But the gauges told a different story. Engine temperature stayed normal, oil pressure was steady, and cylinder heads, the part most at risk of overheating, actually ran cooler. As confidence grew, pilots began using Lindbergh's technique on longer missions. The difference in fuel usage was undeniable. Flights that had once required immediate return after hitting a target now allowed extra time to patrol the area. Pilots no longer had to constantly worry about running out of gas. Some came back with reserves to spare. The P-38's range, which had topped out around 570 miles, began to stretch, first to 700 miles, then 750. Suddenly, they could reach targets they had never thought were possible, stay in the fight for 15 minutes, and still head home with enough fuel to spare an hour in the air. It was a game changer. The doubts vanished as more and more missions proved the method worked. Lindbergh kept flying with the 475th, logging combat hours and showing by example that he could keep up with and even lead the best of them. And when he did lead, his call sign was simple, Mr. Lindbergh. He also helped the other pilots understand why it worked. He explained the physics in plain terms. Engines make power by burning fuel to create pressure, which pushes pistons. The more fuel you burn per second, the more power you get, but also the more fuel you waste. The trick is finding the sweet spot where you get the most power for the least fuel burned. Standard high RPM cruise settings burned a lot of fuel because the engine was cycling rapidly, often faster than necessary. By lowering the RPM and raising manifold pressure, you could produce the same amount of power with fewer combustion cycles. That meant better fuel use per mile. Using the lean mixture setting helped even more. It gave the engine just enough fuel for a full burn, unlike the auto-rich setting which added extra fuel to keep the engine cool, but wasted a lot in the process. Pilots had feared that running oversquare would lead to detonation, but Lindbergh showed that wasn't the case. The power output he recommended wasn't extreme. The 30 inches of manifold pressure he used was moderate, nowhere near the 60 inches used for full combat or emergency power. Running the engines at lower RPM actually reduced wear and tear on engine components. Lindbergh's method wasn't risky. It was just different from what pilots had been taught. His deep knowledge came from years of experience flying long distances. Back in 1927, his solo Atlantic crossing had taught him that the numbers printed in flight manuals weren't hard limits. They were just guidelines. In the 1930s, while flying transocean routes for Pan Am, he had logged thousands of hours fine-tuning how to stretch fuel farther than anyone thought possible. The P-38 had one major advantage that made this kind of experimentation less dangerous. It had two engines. If one failed because of the new cruising method, the other could still get the pilot home. In the vast stretches of Pacific, where mechanical trouble usually meant a fatal ditching or capture by enemy forces, pilots flying single-engine fighters had no choice but to be extra cautious. But with a twin-engine aircraft like the Lightning, Lindbergh saw room to safely test the limits. He also knew the supply situation. Allison was shipping spare V-1710 engines and replacement parts to Pacific bases in good numbers. If something did go wrong, mechanics could quickly install a new engine. Given the massive range boost Lindbergh's technique offered, that small risk seemed worth it. And it paid off. Not a single engine failed because of his cruise settings. By late July 1944, word of Lindbergh's fuel-saving methods had spread across other P-38 units in the 5th Air Force. The success of the 475th Fighter Group was impossible to ignore. Pilots talked. Ground crews compared notes. Squadrons wanted to know why Satan's angels had such an edge. Lindbergh gave more briefings to pilots from other units. He explained the techniques clearly, answered technical questions, and addressed concerns about engine safety. Adoption wasn't instant or universal, but it kept growing. Then came one of the most memorable moments of Lindbergh's time with the 475th. On July 28, 1944, he flew an escort mission to the Sarmy area with the 433rd Squadron. Flying in a four-ship element over El Papeete Bay, Lindbergh held the Blue 3 position. That day, they ran into enemy aircraft. Two Japanese Mitsubishi Ki-51 Sonya light bombers, typically used for recon and ground attacks, were on their way back from a search mission. They belonged to the 73rd Independent Flying Company. One was flown by the unit's commanding officer, Captain Saburo Shimada, the other by Sergeant Yakogi. The American fighters attacked. The Sonyas were no match for the faster, better-armed P-38s. In theory, it should have been a quick engagement. But Captain Shimada wasn't going down without a fight. The battle had already started before Lindbergh's flight arrived. Pilots from the 9th Fighter Squadron had first engaged the Sonyas. Sergeant Yakogi's plane was hit by cannon fire from Lieutenant Wade Lewis. The left wing caught fire. As it tried to escape, Lieutenant J.C. has slip-moved into position and fired a burst. The damaged plane trailed smoke and crashed into the sea. Captain Shimada kept fighting. For half an hour, he outflew multiple P-38s. He pushed his plane through tight turns, banking hard with visible condensation streaming off the wingtips. Despite being in a slower aircraft, Shimada used tighter turning ability to his advantage. The American pilots had speed, but they couldn't keep their guns on target. Captain Danforth Miller, who was flying as McDonald's wingman, got a brief shot and opened fire, but Shimada pulled a hard turn to left, and Miller's rounds missed by about 80 feet. Then Shimada made a bold move. Instead of continuing to dodge, he turned his aircraft straight toward Lindbergh. The two planes closed in on each other fast, nearly 500 miles per hour combined. For Lindbergh, who had spent years in the cockpit and logged thousands of flying hours, but had never before been face-to-face with an enemy trying to kill him, that moment hit with full force. The reality of combat was now painfully, unmistakably real. Captain Shimada stayed on his path. Whether he was trying to ram Lindbergh's aircraft or aiming for a head-on exchange, he was fully committed to the attack. Lindbergh instinctively aimed at the Sonya's radial engine and pulled the trigger. The nose-mounted firepower of the P-38, a 20mm cannon, and 4.50 caliber machine guns unleashed a 6-second burst. Rounds slammed into the front of the Japanese bomber. The propeller visibly slowed, and smoke poured from the engine. Still, Shimada held course. At the last possible second, Lindbergh yanked the control column back, pulling his P-38 up and over the stricken Sonya, missing it by just a few feet. Shimada's aircraft went into a steep dive. Other P-38 pilots fired more bursts as it fell. The plane kept diving, trailing smoke, until it slammed into the sea. A tall splash of white marked the impact. Foam rippled outward, then faded. The ocean looked untouched, as if nothing had happened. Captain Saburo Shimada and his observer were gone. Back at base, pilots debated who should be credited with the kill. Several had hit the Sonya. McDonald, Miller, and Lindbergh all score hits. But it was Lindbergh's direct head-on burst that crippled the plane and sent it diving. Unofficially, everyone agreed Lindbergh had scored his first and only aerial victory. It was never recorded in the official records. Lindbergh was still a civilian. His combat role had been unusual from the start. Listing a confirmed kill would have drawn the wrong kind of attention and possibly ended his involvement. 3 days later, on August 1st, Lindbergh nearly didn't make it back. During a fighter sweep over Palau Islands, his flight ran into Japanese Zeros. In the dogfight that followed, Lindbergh ended up in a turning fight with one of the enemy fighters. The Zero nearly got him. McDonald, flying nearby, saw what was happening and shouted over the radio, "Break right! Break right!" Lindbergh reacted just in time. McDonald jumped in and engaged the Zero himself, saving Lindbergh's life. That close call was a final straw for 5th Air Force Headquarters. Lindbergh had proven his value. He'd flown around 50 combat missions in the Pacific. About half of those were the 475th Fighter Group. He'd taken part in live combat, taught the unit how to dramatically extend their aircraft's range, and even shot down an enemy plane. He had also come within inches of being killed. It was time to send him home. On August 12, 1944, Lindbergh left Hollandia. The pilots of the 475th gathered to see him off. Their respect for him was real. He hadn't just shown up with ideas. He had flown beside them, fought beside them, and proven himself where reputation didn't matter. But Lindbergh's impact went far beyond just one squadron. By October 1944, P-38 pilots across the Pacific were using some version of his cruise control method. The exact numbers vary depending on conditions, but the fundamentals remain the same. Lower RPM, higher manifold pressure, and a leaner fuel mix, all aimed at getting more distance out of every gallon. The results changed everything. Targets that were once out of reach were now within range. Japanese bases that had never faced American fighter escorts suddenly had P-38s showing up with enough fuel to fight and make it back. The extended range allowed bombers to fly with protection on missions that had once gone unescorted or hadn't been flown at all. Long-range sweeps now pushed deeper into Japanese-held territory. By the end of 1944, P-38 groups in Dutch New Guinea were flying missions up to 950 miles out, staying in the fight for 15 minutes and returning safely. None of this had been possible before Lindbergh's techniques were adopted. This wasn't a minor improvement. The increased range had a direct impact on the broader war effort. It helped support General MacArthur's push toward the Philippines. Airfields that had once been too far for fighter support became viable. Invasion plans could move forward without waiting for new bases to be built. The real impact wasn't just measured in miles. It was measured in time. Operations that might have taken months were now being completed in weeks, all because fighters could fly farther, faster, and stay in the fight longer. Lindbergh's technique didn't just boost range. It saved lives. Pilots who used to return to base with their fuel gauges on empty now had enough in reserve for unexpected detours or bad weather. If they took damage in combat, those extra gallons often made the difference between crashing and making it back. This buffer helped cut down on aircraft losses from non-combat causes, something that quietly taken a toll throughout the war. The technique became especially valuable during the campaign to liberate the Philippines. When General MacArthur's forces landed on Leyte in October 1944, P-38s flying from New Guinea and Morotai were able to provide fighter cover across distances that had been out of reach just months earlier. The difference wasn't just about range. It was about what that range allowed them to do. Reaching a target with no reserve left pilots with few options. Reaching it with enough fuel to stay, fight, and get home changed everything. Still, the new approach wasn't accepted overnight. Some commanders were wary. They had concerns about long-term engine wear. Many pilots trusted the training they received more than advice from a civilian. And some maintenance crews feared the low RPM, high manifold pressure approach would eventually lead to engine damage. But the numbers told a different story. Units using Lindbergh's technique weren't seeing higher engine failure rates. Fuel use dropped significantly. Mission reports started to show a clear trend. Flights that would have been impossible before were now being flown successfully. By the end of 1944, Lindbergh's cruise control method had been officially adopted into standard P-38 operating procedures. What started as a civilian observer's idea became formal doctrine. The U.S. Army Air Forces even updated the cruise charts for the P-38 to reflect its findings. Training materials were revised to include proper lean-of-peak mixture use, something that had previously been overlooked. Lindbergh's time in the Pacific revealed more than just technical skill. It showed a man trying to rebuild his legacy. Before the war, his isolationist stance had made him a controversial figure. He had spoken publicly about advanced aviation in Nazi Germany, which led to accusations of Nazi sympathy. His leadership in opposing U.S. involvement in World War II put him at odds with the White House, especially President Roosevelt, who cut off Lindbergh's path to serve in uniform. When war broke out, Lindbergh became a national outcast, despite being one of the most accomplished pilots in American history. But in the Pacific, far from political noise, his value came through. Marines and Army Air Force pilots judged him not by headlines, but by what he could actually do in the air. Major Richard Bong, America's top-scoring ace with 40 confirmed kills, once told a United Press reporter that Lindbergh was as sharp as any of them. He would have been out there knocking off Japs every day if General Kenny had let him. Bong said. Coming from someone like Bong, that kind of praise meant more than any public statement could. Lindbergh had earned his place the hard way. After returning to the U.S. in mid-August 1944, Lindbergh didn't slow down. In October, he took part in a joint Army-Navy conference on fighter performance at Naval Air Station Patuxent River in Maryland. He flew captured Japanese aircraft and helped analyze their capabilities. He continued working as a technical consultant for United Aircraft and other firms, helping troubleshoot the problems faced by combat units in real time. The performance gains he helped unlock for the P-38 were massive. The P-38J model carried about 410 gallons of fuel internally, two 90-gallon main tanks, two 60-gallon reserves, and two 55-gallon tanks in the wings. It could also carry external drop tanks, pushing total capacity past 1,000 gallons. At the standard cruise setting of 2,200 revolutions per minute, an auto-rich mixture, the plane burned through fuel quickly. Estimates varied, but consumption was significantly higher than what Lindbergh achieved. Using his method, 1,600 revolutions per minute, lean mixture, and 30 inches of manifold pressure, fuel use dropped to around 70 gallons per hour in total. That extended the P-38's combat radius from roughly 570 miles to about 750 miles, a 31% increase, using the same reserves and engagement time. For missions requiring even more range, crews could add drop tanks and fully apply Lindbergh's technique. These missions stretched close to 9 hours, covering more than 1,000 miles round trip. Lindbergh's techniques didn't just improve performance, they reshaped how the war was fought in the Pacific. The success of the island-hopping campaign, which defined General MacArthur's advance through New Guinea and into the Philippines, depended heavily on securing air superiority at each step. Fighter range determined which islands could be skipped and which needed to be taken to establish forward airfields. By significantly increasing the P-38's range, Lindbergh made it possible to plan more aggressively. Islands that once required dangerous amphibious assaults could now be bypassed because fighters had the fuel to strike from farther away. Some people have wrongly credited Lindbergh with the long-range flying used during the April 1943 mission to shoot down Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto. That mission did push the P-38 to its limits, but it took place more than a year before Lindbergh arrived in the Pacific. His real contribution was making those types of long-distance missions routine, not rare exceptions. What makes Lindbergh's achievement even more impressive is the personal element. At 42, he was flying side by side with pilots often half his age. The physical toll of combat, high G-turns, long hours in tight cockpits, extreme fatigue, hit everyone hard. Lindbergh never asked for special treatment. He flew the same grueling missions as the younger pilots. He took the same risks, and he followed the same rules. That willingness to lead by example was key. If he had stayed on the ground and simply delivered lectures about fuel efficiency, most pilots would have ignored him. But he didn't talk from behind a desk. He flew, fought, and showed that his techniques worked in real combat, and that earned respect. Beyond just improving fuel economy, Lindbergh proved something bigger. Civilian experts could bring real value to frontline combat operations. Military culture naturally prioritizes rank, service, and combat experience. But modern warfare depends heavily on technical knowledge, and much of that expertise exists outside the military. Lindbergh showed that if civilians with the right skills were given a chance, they could help make military forces more effective. His success opened the door for more collaboration. After Lindbergh, commanders became more willing to work with civilian engineers, test pilots, and researchers from aircraft and engine manufacturers. That cooperation sped up innovation across the war effort. The P-38 Lightning itself also deserves recognition. Its twin-engine design gave it a safety margin that allowed experimentation without the same risk single-engine fighters faced. While the Allison V-1710 engines had their critics, they responded well when managed carefully, especially with proper fuel mixture techniques. The P-38's complex fuel system allowed pilots to fine-tune their fuel use in flight, and the plane's stable handling made it ideal for long-range cruising. By late 1944 and into 1945, some units began switching to the P-51 Mustang, which offered better high-altitude performance and excellent range. But in the Pacific, the P-38 remained a key asset. Its dual engines gave pilots more security during long overwater missions. Its concentrated firepower delivered real results in combat, and its low to mid-altitude maneuverability made it ideal for conditions in the Pacific theater. When flown using Lindbergh's methods, the P-38's range remained unmatched. The results speak for themselves. The 475th Fighter Group, which flew P-38s exclusively, became the top P-38 unit of the war, with 551 confirmed aerial victories. Major Thomas McGuire, who scored 38 of those kills, was the second highest scoring American ace, and he did flying a lightning with the 475th. Thanks to its combination of range, reliability, and firepower, enhanced by Lindbergh's cruise control techniques, the P-38 dominated Pacific skies. It could fly farther, stay in the fight longer, and return home more safely. Across thousands of missions and countless hours in the air, the cumulative impact of these improvements was enormous, even hard to measure on paper. Lindbergh's story also reveals the complex tension between individual expertise and institutional boundaries. Because of his pre-war political views, Lindbergh wasn't welcomed into military service. President Roosevelt personally blocked him from wearing a uniform. Despite being one of the most skilled aviators in the country, he was sidelined by politics. The Army Air Forces needed exactly the kind of expertise Charles Lindbergh had. The solution, granting him unofficial civilian status with informal approval to fly combat missions, was unconventional and would never pass under modern military regulations. But at the time, it worked. The usual red tape gave way to what was practical and effective, and the impact on the war was immense. The pilots who flew with Lindbergh in 1944 never forgot him. Even decades later, veterans of the 475th Fighter Group spoke with respect about the civilian who flew alongside them as an equal and taught them to fly farther than they thought possible. Colonel Warren Lewis, who commanded the 432nd Squadron, could still recall Lindbergh's fuel-saving settings in detail years later. The exact numbers varied slightly depending on conditions and aircraft, but the concept was the same, and the results spoke for themselves. Charles Lindbergh died on August 26, 1974, at the age of 72 after a battle with lymphoma. Just days earlier, he had quietly left Columbia Presbyterian Hospital in New York and flown to his home in Kipolu, Maui. He passed away a week later. 3 hours after his death, Lindbergh was laid to rest in a simple grave behind Palapalahomo Church. Hawaiian ranch hands built his coffin by hand and dressed in their work clothes for the burial. The grave was lined with lava rock and black beach stones. Only 15 people attended. His marker is a plain concrete slab engraved with a line from Psalm 139. If I take the wings of the morning and dwell in the uttermost parts of the sea. Lindbergh's wartime journals, published in 1970, offered a detailed account of his time in the Pacific, including his work with the 475th. But Lindbergh's true legacy wasn't just about the fuel-saving techniques themselves. It was the principles he demonstrated that still matter today. Technical knowledge is critical in combat, not just in labs. Civilian experts can make meaningful contributions if given the chance. Standard procedures should evolve when evidence supports change. Demonstration is more powerful than theory, and no system, no matter how refined, is beyond improvement. What Lindbergh achieved in the Pacific was a rare intersection of deep expertise and real operational need. The theater demanded fighters that could fly farther than current tactics allowed. The P-38 was capable, but underused. Lindbergh, with decades of experience focusing on fuel efficiency, had the knowledge. The war gave him the platform to prove it, and he had the nerve to put himself in the cockpit and show it worked. He didn't pull rank. He didn't rely on fame. He flew as one of the team and proved his ideas in the harshest environment possible. Just as German prisoners during the war were stunned by the scale of American industry, Lindbergh's fellow pilots were changed by something more subtle: the power of technical insight, applied with clarity and courage. The effect was no less transformative. German POWs saw what industrial freedom could produce. American fighter pilots saw what one man's knowledge could do to change their survival odds and their reach. The P-38 Lightning continued flying until the end of the war. Its twin-boom silhouette became an icon of U.S. air power in the Pacific. Pilots who flew it, quirks and all, remembered it with pride. And those who flew it in 1944 remembered the civilian who showed them that published limits weren't hard limits. They were just the starting point. That's Lindbergh's real legacy in the Pacific. Not just the missions or the numbers, but the knowledge shared. He came as an observer. He left as a teacher. He arrived as a famous name and departed as a trusted comrade. He unlocked an aircraft's true potential not through invention, but through understanding, and had the courage to prove better methods existed. The pilots of Satan's angels never forgot what he gave them. Because of Lindbergh, they flew farther, stayed in the fight longer, and returned home safer. All because one man knew more about fuel efficiency than anyone else in the theater. That knowledge, tested in combat and spread across the Pacific, became one of the most effective and unexpected technical innovations of the air war. And it didn't come from a lab or a design office. It came from one man who had mastered an art decades earlier over the Atlantic and applied in a way that made all the difference in 1944. The core lesson never changed. Understand the aircraft, manage its systems with precision, and never assume that the printed specs are the final word. For 6 weeks in 1944, Charles Lindbergh taught that lesson to some of the best pilots in the Pacific, and they passed it on, changing the way America fought the air war.